Man, it's been over a year since I last talked about a Nihon Falcom game of any kind, and nearly 2 years since I talked about The Legend of Heroes specifically. There were games that came out in that time. Trails from Zero and Trails to Azure finally came to the West, and they were both great, especially on Nintendo Switch. But today, we're talking about the latest game in the series timeline to leave Asia, The Legend of Heroes Trails into Reverie. Trails into Reverie serves 3 roles. It's a bow on the package of Trails of Cold Steel, it's a long overdue epilogue to the Crossbell games, and it bridges into Kuro no Kiseki as a prologue of sorts. Today, we're going to find out if it manages to hammer these 3 points home. Further, we're going to find out how the Nintendo Switch version stacks up on the technical side of things. As always with Trails games, please be aware that Reverie contains significant spoilers for the series' preceding entries, from the Sky Trilogy to the Crossbell Duology to the Cold Steel Quadrilogy. If you'd like to avoid those spoilers, this is your opportunity to click away. In the meantime, please subscribe and click the bell to stay updated on all my new content. You can also check out my library of videos, including my Nihon Falcom dedicated playlist in the upper right hand corner and in the end card. Okay, you've been warned, so let's get this show on the road. This review is based on physical retail releases for the PlayStation 5 and Nintendo Switch. I'm gonna mix up the order of this review today. Let's start with the gameplay. Reverie is basically unchanged from Trails of Cold Steel 4. Battles are turn-based and rely on the interplay between physical positioning on the field, standard melee attacks, magical arts that use EP, and special techniques called crafts that use CP. There are also super attacks called S-crafts, and you can use an S-craft at any point via an S-break, skipping the user forward in the turn order at the cost of greater delay after the attack is used. Unbalancing an enemy lets you hit one of 3 types of tandem moves, a linked user follow-up that nets you 1 Brave Point or BP, a double team attack that costs 2 BP, or an active party barrage that burns 5 BP. Brave Orders are special commands that grant bonuses like increased defense or physical reflect. Brave Orders cost BP as well, so it's a balancing act between should I go for more damage dealt right now, or should I buff my party so I can set something up in a few turns. Each weapon has a damage type, and exploiting damage and elemental weaknesses can stagger enemies, a functionality that Trails calls Break. Breaking an enemy allows you to have consistent follow-up attacks for greater damage and/or BP recovery. And finally, there are combat links. When 2 active party members are combat linked together, they earn link levels, and higher link levels unlock better link abilities to aid you in combat. These are not to be confused with social links, which is the non-combat feature for romancing allies, and social links do not return in Reverie. Instead, you either import your save from Cold Steel 4, or you can just pick who you romanced before the game begins. And like all the recent Trails games, Reverie has a fast-forward mode, which makes it a lot easier to navigate the game. There is one new core combat feature: United Fronts. During an encounter, you can hold R2 or ZR to initiate one of 3 flavors of United Fronts. United Assault for physical attacks, United Art, which deals magical damage, and United Boost, a party healing command. It's not a huge functionality, but it adds more depth to an already deep system of mechanics, and it's so satisfying to encounter an enemy, cue a United Front, and just win the whole battle without breaking a sweat. The other big change to the game is that there are basically no side quests. Instead, Reverie introduces a special zone that contains all the extraneous content you'd normally expect in a Trails game. I won't say much more to avoid spoilers, but suffice it to say, the new area is substantial, and has a few interesting additions to the series. Still, the basic gameplay is much unchanged from Cold Steel 4. All the same mechanics are there, they all fit together just the same, and they all play just as well, with 1 or 2 added bonuses to keep things fresh just a little bit longer. No need to reinvent the wheel, at least not until Kuro no Kiseki. Audio is up next, and Falcom games usually have good music. I like the callbacks to the past sub-series of Trails, and I think the music does a good job plucking at that nostalgia for veteran players. Still, don't go expecting any sweeping scores like RPGs from larger studios. Voice work is great, as usual. Reverie in particular has a ton of characters from across the series, and the spoken dialogue delivers on all fronts, though I did notice the English had some minor equalization issues.
That went well, didn't it?
Everything's falling into place now.
Yeah. Tia, Yuna, I need you to get ready.
Roger that! Now installing anti-corruption system.
うまくいったわね。
これでようやく条件が整ったか。
ああ、ティオ、ユナ、準備を。
了解しました。対侵食プログラムのインストールを開始します。
Overall, there's not really a bad choice here for voice acting, and I played the game in English as I've done with all the Kiseki games. Okay, now that we got the stuff that's basically business as usual out of the way, let's get to the nitty-gritty. We'll start with a story. 5 months after the end of Cold Steel 4, Trails into Reverie sees past protagonist Lloyd Bannings leading the Special Support Section against the returning Supreme Chancellor Rufus Alborea. The Supreme Chancellor forcibly installs himself at the head of the Crossbellin government and reveals his plan to subjugate the entire world under his banner. Over in Erebonia, Reen Schwarzer is tasked with finding the missing Prince Olivert, reuniting Class 7 for one more mission. All the while, an unknown figure using the familiar mononym C is making moves in the background, and the 3 stories converge to reveal a twisted web of machinations. By no means is Reverie a short game, but compared to the 120-some-odd hours of its predecessors, Reverie's 40 to 50-hour runtime is much easier to consume. I felt like the pacing of the story was good without being too overwhelming. One minor complaint that I had is that there's a lot of switching back and forth between protagonists, and it sometimes leaves the story feeling fragmentary. On the other hand, there are times when it feels excellent and engaging to switch back and forth, especially towards the latter segments of the story. I can't really say much more without spoilers. Needless to say, the events that unfolded held my interest throughout, and I enjoyed finishing out the major journeys of the series' past champions. All this comes from a position of knowledge, however. If you're new to the Kiseki series, digesting Reverie's story will be a challenge in its own right. More so than ever before, you need to know what occurred in Crossbell and Erebonia, and to a lesser extent Liberl. Without at least some semblance of understanding as to what's going on, it's going to be way harder to pick through Reverie's story. I think the central plot will make enough sense if you don't quite understand the nuances of everything happening, but there's definitely more than a bit of required reading this time around if you want to enjoy Reverie to the fullest. Still, I enjoyed this game's narrative about as much as I liked the stories of the individual Crossbell games, and diving back into the lush, detailed history of Zemuria was warm, nostalgic, and comfortable. We'll close this out with the visuals and technical performance, the latter of which has been real hit and miss for Falcom, depending on the platform. Like all Falcom titles, Reverie's visuals are not the main draw. The game was never going to look better than your Final Fantasy XVIs or your Persona 5s, but it's still a decent looking game, in the same vein as your Cold Steel 4 and Ys 9. I haven't really mentioned this in any of my past Nihon Falcom videos, but I think the color choices Falcom makes in its games really keep things from feeling outright old. Don't get me wrong, their engine is still pretty old, but it masquerades well as an art style thanks to some smart design choices, color usage being the most obvious. And again, you don't play Falcom games for the graphics. On the technical side, the PS5 frame rate is solid, and the resolution is frankly a little bit surprising. For absolutely no reason whatsoever, Reverie on PS5 renders in 2160p. Thanks in part to the graphical design, the game also achieves its targeted 60 frames per second pretty much the whole way through, though I did notice some minor stuttering on rare occasions. Turbo mode does a good enough job hiding these instances, as it always has. Reverie has slightly improved textures and draw distance on PS5 compared to its series counterparts on PS4, and the shadows are better too, thanks to what appears to be some usage of ambient occlusion. There's just better visual contrast in Reverie, but unless you're really pressing your face up to the screen, I doubt anyone would even notice. The Switch version is where it gets interesting, as always. Let's start with the expected sights. Obviously, the textures and lighting have been noticeably downgraded, and the lushness of any foliage has been cut down. Character models still look good, though there's definitely some softness around the edges compared to PlayStation. Also, the aliasing is significant, and it's even noticeable in handheld mode, so be prepared for a lot of shimmering textures. Switch Reverie's resolution appears to be much the same as Cold Steel 3 and 4 on Switch, sitting at a native 720p docked and an upscaled 720p handheld, with a target 30 FPS for both styles. This permits a decent visual parity for Reverie, similar to what was seen in Ys 9 on Switch, and Switch Reverie looks pretty good in its stills. Here's where the surprises start for me. Reverie on Switch runs noticeably better than Trails of Cold Steel 3 and 4 on Switch. The frame rate is generally steadier across the board, delivering a much more playable experience. In my time with the game, I encountered exactly one micro-freeze, and it was during a dialogue when I hit the text fast-forward button near a steamy footbath during a screen transition. There are semi-regular instances of frame pacing inconsistency, but it's leagues better than its precursors. Let's look at performance during traversal. Here in Crossbell, the East District is perfectly fine. Smooth animation, fluent movement, it feels good. Over on Station Street, there's a bit of trouble, mostly noticeable when moving the camera and player character at the same time. The Harbor District has a few troubles as well, though it's all quite manageable while in TV play. The cause comes from the variety and complexity of the content on screen, not necessarily just the size of the map. For example, the large Entertainment District runs fine, but the smaller West District is a bit choppy when facing the bakery. Further, Switch Revery's combat runs a lot smoother than the Cold Steel Switch games, even without high-speed mode enabled. There are still faults depending on the breadth of detail and quantity of enemies, but it's demonstrably better than my experience with Switch Cold Steel. And thankfully, Switch Reverie never crashed on me, but I'd still recommend saving frequently just to be safe. The central, unavoidable issue with the Switch ports is the load times. They're still excessively long compared to PlayStation. Here's a scene in real time from the beginning of the game to compare Nintendo and PlayStation load times.
The time has come for us to rise. Rise and reclaim our imperial pride. Victory was within our grasp, and yet the foolish cowards who govern us chose to abandon it. But though they may turn a blind eye to the threat of the East, you know as well as we do that it remains ever present. The Imperial Army turned tail and fled, but we can still take up arms and fight! Together, we can defeat Calvert and all who resist us, and reign supreme over the continent!
Portable play is where the most significant problems appear. Everywhere that docked mode has problems, handheld play has the same issues in spades. Frame rates dip almost into single digits at times, and turbo speed during these moments actually exacerbates the lack of player control rather than masking the issue. Cutscenes also have consistency issues on the tablet. Here are some random clips from the prologue, this time in handheld presentation. It must be reiterated that playing on the go hides many of the Switch version's performance issues, and I'm actually stunned at how many of these issues were easy to miss on the Switch tablet screen, even on a better, bigger display like the OLED. But for every one or two problems that could be missed, there's at least one flaw that cannot. And at last, we've made it to the screen wipe transitions. Let's start with Nintendo Switch handheld. Again, since it's not in motion, it looks fine here. There's a decent amount of visual noise, but nothing that a smaller display cannot mask. Here's Switch docked. The image is a bit sharper, if only just a touch, and it still looks decent sitting still. And here's PlayStation 5. A really good looking Falcom game, and the visual improvements seen on PS5 over PS4 are subtle, but they are appreciated. Again, it's all pretty simple. The PlayStation version looks good and runs well, another solid, if utilitarian experience for Falcom. Meanwhile, the Nintendo version has the requisite downgrades across the board. It's interesting to go from Final Fantasy to Trails back to back. Obviously, Falcom can't and isn't trying to compete with the big budget production values of the Square Enix behemoth. Instead, Trails has always focused on its complex, interwoven narrative spanning decades of real time. Trails into Reverie excels when it follows these chords, but the game as a whole doesn't capitalize on the series' strengths the same way its immediate precursors did. Though this is by design with Reverie playing the part of epilogue, it makes for a lesser, if still enjoyable game overall. The Nintendo Switch version has its expected issues, but it also has some interesting surprises this time around, and I'm hopeful that the technical performance of future Falcom games on Switch continue to trend upward. On any platform, I had fun wrapping up some loose ends with these beloved characters, of which there are over 50 that are playable. And Reverie's shorter runtime makes for a more up-tempo cadence, a pacing befitting its role as an epilogue. This isn't these characters' grandest adventure, nor is it trying to be. It's the dot on the exclamation point punctuating the final sentence of Trail's latest chapters. But truly, Revery's biggest strength is that it sets us up for the Republic of Calvard sub-series. The current Falcom engine and these Crossbellin and Erebonian storylines have each run their due course, and I'm looking forward to something completely new. So can we please get any information on Western releases for Kuro no Kiseki and Kuro no Kiseki 2? Please and thank you. The Legend of Heroes Trails into Reverie earns a 7.5 on PlayStation 5 and a 7 on Nintendo Switch. Please subscribe, click the bell, and check out my other Falcom content on screen. Arigatou gozaimasu. Minasan, ごきげんよう。さようなら。